10 compulsory questions on the history of Nigerian mass media you will always see in your exams. Here are 10 compulsory questions. Not that you will find them in one exam as compulsory questions, but they will always come in different shapes in any exam on the history of Nigerian mass media. So here are 10 compulsory questions. We break them in parts. Now this is part 1. Let's take the first question. The Nigerian mass media, in brackets newspapers, radio, television, contributed immensely to the political, economic, social, religious, and cultural development of Nigeria. Give a general explanation of these contributions in several areas while providing detailed discussions in the area of politics. Now, this question could come in any form. It could just come like this: explain the contributions of the Nigerian mass media in the development of Nigeria. Or I can say, explain the contributions of the Nigerian mass media in political development of Nigeria or in the struggle for independence. But the fact is that most times you find a question asking you to explain the contributions of the Nigerian mass media in the development of the country. Now, to respond to this question, always use this trick. The trick is use the basic functions of the mass media to answer this question. You know, this is history of Nigerian mass media. You can never remember the exact dates, and if you try to cram what you have in your notes, it may be difficult to remember. So what you do is this: use the basic functions of the mass media to answer this question. And the basic functions of the mass media are to inform, to educate, and to entertain. So anyone that matches your response, use it. So how do you answer this question? The mass media in Nigeria made tremendous contributions in the development of the country. They played the basic roles of education, information, and entertainment. Politically, you have the pre- and post-independence contributions. That is, the contributions before independence, that's the pre-independence contributions, and then the contributions they made after independence. So you can look at the question from these two angles. Let's quickly look at the pre-independence contributions. The mass media contributed to the struggle for independence. They contributed in nationalist struggles. Most of the newspaper owners were nationalists who used their newspapers to enlighten the public on the need for independence. For example, Nnamdi Azikiwe and his chain of newspapers, West African Pilot, Nigerian Spokesman, Eastern Guardian, and Southern Nigeria Defender. They were all used by Nnamdi Azikiwe to promote the cause for independence, to raise people's consciousness towards the need for independence. You also had Ernest Ikoli, who used his African Messenger, that's his newspaper, to promote independence too. That was before he now worked as the first editor of Daily Times. Others are Duse Mohammed, Anthony Enahoro, John Payne Jackson, who was a Liberian, but he used his newspaper, Lagos Weekly Record, to promote independence, to even criticize the colonial government then over their harsh treatment of Nigerians. The mass media also promoted regional consciousness among Nigerians. This is in addition to promoting national unity. They made the regions understand the need to have a voice. They made the regions understand their position and role in the country called Nigeria. The mass media also played a role in political education. People were made to understand their role in elections and how to hold their leaders accountable. This happened even before independence. So the mass media played various roles in political development of the country. All you need to do is be brief on this point so that you can also include other points. The mass media also played part in educational development of Nigeria, even before independence. For instance, Iwe Irohin, the first newspaper in Nigeria established by Reverend Henry Townsend in 1859, was basically aimed at raising the literacy level of Eba people. The mass media also carried educational content that enlightened the people. Culturally, the mass media were used to promote cultural heritage. They carried stories about festivals and such other local events. Many local language newspapers encouraged preservation of local languages and indigenous language education. A newspaper like Gaskia Tafe Kwabo, for instance, which was established by Northern Nigeria government in 1939, was the first local language newspaper in Africa. It used impressive Hausa language writing style, which was rich in spelling, grammar, and vocabulary. So people loved their language because they were local language newspapers that were informing them, educating them, and entertaining them. Still on culture, the mass media promote cultural values, norms of society, and give Nigerians sense of identity through various stories and articles on culture. They played this role before independence, they played it after independence, and they are still playing it till today. On religion, the mass media promoted religious institutions in the society by reporting stories about Christianity, Islam, and traditional African religion. Iwe Irohin, for instance, carried stories about church activities, arrival and departure of church dignitaries. Many other media that were established afterwards also promoted religious diversity of the country. The mass media played this role before independence, they are still playing it till today. So you should know how to apply these answers while responding to this question during exam. In terms of their post-independence contributions, the mass media also contributed to the development of Nigeria after independence. This was when the broadcast media began to make contributions to the development of the nation after the first television station was established in 1959 by the Western Nigeria government, and that was Western Nigeria Television, WNTV. It was also the first in Africa. So what you do here is this. You use the same approach you used in explaining the contributions of the Nigerian mass media before independence to also explain their contributions after independence. Politically, the mass media promoted unity in diversity, and they still do so today. They give the numerous ethnic nationalities in Nigeria a voice through various newspapers, radio and television stations. They raise political consciousness and help in political education, especially making people aware of their role in election, whom to vote for, and why. The mass media still teach people how to hold their leaders accountable. They used to do it before independence, they still do it today. They promote democracy by playing their watchdog role effectively in the society. So while responding to this question, you use the same points you mentioned on culture, education, and religion to also refer to the contributions of the mass media after independence. This is because the media are still playing the same socio-cultural role, promoting religion, political and economic development functions through diverse, interesting, informative, educative, and entertainment contents today. They are promoting unity in diversity, peace, and entrepreneurship development. You can use modern examples of programs on radio and television or specific issues covered by newspapers and other media to buttress your point. Just keep your answer simple and straight to the point.
Question number 2. Question number 2. Iwe Irohin, Anglo-African, the Lagos Times and Gold Coast Advertiser, and the Weekly Record were early newspapers that blazed the trail for the Nigerian press. How did these newspapers begin? When were they established? Who owned them? What did they contain? How did they cease to exist? And what contributions did they make? Now, this is another popular question, or another question that always appears in any exam in different ways. You could be asked to list about 4 early newspapers and explain their history. You could be asked to briefly provide the history of at least 4 early newspapers, and that is what you have here. Iwe Irohin, Anglo-African, the Lagos Times and Gold Coast Advertiser, that's one newspaper. Lagos Times and Gold Coast Advertiser, and then the Weekly Record. These were newspapers that blazed the trail for development of the Nigerian mass media. They were the early newspapers. They were among the early press that actually ushered in several other newspapers and the broadcast media that gave us what we have today as the Nigerian press. So what you have here is list and explain at least 4 newspapers that blazed the trail in the history of Nigerian press, or briefly provide the history of 4 pioneer newspapers in the Nigerian press history. So the question could come in any format. Now look at what you do. Just talk about the brief history of these newspapers. You don't really need to be detailed, otherwise you won't remember. Just know their publishers and the day they were established. Also know when they ceased to exist. When you are talking about the contributions of these newspapers, you can use the answer you gave for one of the newspapers to relate to the other newspapers, because they all made the same contribution, even though in different ways. But they contributed in terms of political struggle, they contributed in terms of religious development, they contributed to the education development of the country in different ways. So you don't need to remember exactly what each one did. Just use the same answer that you've given for one to relate to the others, because the contributions are related. Let's quickly look at these 4 newspapers. We've created a table for them. This table will make it easy for you to understand. You can just look at the table and then pick out the points. That's the best way to look at these 4 newspapers. Now let's start with Iwe Irohin. Iwe Irohin, that's the first newspaper in Nigeria, published by Reverend Henry Townsend of Church Missionary Society. The newspaper was published in 1859. The publisher was Reverend Henry Townsend. Then content. When you are responding to the aspect of content, you should remember that virtually all the newspapers had the same category of contents. So you don't need to remember exactly what each newspaper carried, because this is history. So it will be difficult for you to remember exactly what happened, exactly what they carried. So all you need to do is understand that these newspapers carried news, they carried current affairs, they carried adverts in various ways, and then some of them, like Iwe Irohin, carried news about church activities, dignitaries that came to the church, and then they carried educational content. Iwe Irohin, for instance, carried stories about ordinations, news about church activities, arrival and departure of dignitaries, deaths, births, and announcements about local events. Iwe Irohin also had advert content. It carried adverts too. So you see that all these newspapers had related contents. Anyone you don't remember exactly what it contained, just use the same answer you have given here to relate to all of them, because they had these contents, they had adverts, they had current affairs. And then most of the newspapers at that time, when you talk about the early press, most of the newspapers at that time had contents that advanced the cause for independence. Remember that they were mostly owned by nationalists. So back to Iwe Irohin, we have said publisher is Reverend Henry Townsend. Content, we have said it had announcements, deaths, births, enlightenment contents, news about church activities, and then deaths. Iwe Irohin ceased to exist in 1867. Contributions. Iwe Irohin contributed immensely to the society. It raised literacy awareness among the Eba people. Remember that one of the major goals of Reverend Henry Townsend in establishing Iwe Irohin was to create a literacy program for the people of Eba. It started as a Yoruba newspaper, but eventually it had an English version, and then it was used to raise the consciousness of people on how to read.